On a Tuesday evening in January 1977, a mother in a kitchen somewhere in America set the table exactly the way she had for 20 years. Meat on the plate, butter melting into warm bread, a carton of whole milk sweating on the counter. She had no way of knowing that a report published in Washington that same week was quietly about to rewrite what she put on that table. For the next 50 years, within that time, obesity in America would climb from 13% to over 40%.
What is officially the biggest health crisis in American history. 34% of American adults, 17% of our children are considered obese, and today a government panel issued a brand new plea for all of us to change how we eat. Here's Lindsay Davis.
To understand what changed that table, you have to go back further, to a country that didn't yet see itself as having a diet problem at all. In 1968, the Senate created a committee with a simple, urgent purpose: find the hungry and feed them. Its chairman, a senator from South Dakota named George McGovern, spent the committee's early years chasing stories of malnourished children in Appalachia, of families in the rural South who still didn't have enough to eat. In a country as wealthy as America, that was supposed to be unthinkable. And at tables like hers, it genuinely was unthinkable. By the 1950s and 60s, dinner across the country told a different story. Meat every night, whole milk by the gallon, butter on nearly everything. Supermarket aisles that had been half empty a generation earlier now stretched floor to ceiling. A generation raised under wartime rationing was living in an abundance their own parents never could have imagined. But quietly, something else was rising alongside that abundance: heart disease. By the mid-1970s, killing more Americans every year than any other cause of death in the nation's history. A small, controversial group of scientists, led by a physiologist named Ancel Keys, had spent nearly 2 decades pointing at dietary fat as part of the reason. The theory wasn't proven, wasn't close to settled science, but it was loud enough that a committee built to fight hunger started asking a different kind of question. What if the danger for some Americans wasn't eating too little? What if it was eating the wrong thing? At that same table, in January 1977, obesity in America sat at just 13%. Diabetes was rare enough that most families had never known anyone who had it. That quiet, ordinary table was the baseline about to disappear. No one expected a hunger committee to end up writing the rule book for an entire nation's diet. But that January, in a modest hearing room on Capitol Hill, that's exactly what happened. A report landed on senators' desks that told 220 million Americans, for the first time, precisely what to put on their plates. What it actually said would surprise almost everyone who never read past the headlines. The document was called Dietary Goals for the United States. History would remember it simply as the McGovern Report, and it aimed squarely at that same dinner table: less red meat, less whole milk, less butter, replaced by more whole grains, fruit, and vegetables. Fat, sugar, salt, and cholesterol all had a new ceiling now, spelled out in exact numbers for the first time in American history. At the press conference announcing it, McGovern himself called it the first comprehensive statement any branch of the federal government had ever made about the risks hiding inside the American diet. A confident claim, but not an entirely honest one. This wasn't the unified voice of the nation's nutrition scientists. It was one Senate committee's judgment call, made under real political pressure, built on evidence its own advisors admitted was incomplete. No vote among biochemists, no decade of trials, just 11 senators and a country waiting for an answer. None of them had ever met the mother setting that table. But the document they signed would end up in her kitchen within 3 years. The backlash came fast. Meat producers pushed back. So did dairy associations. And the egg industry was angrier than either. Angry enough to demand its own separate hearing, arguing point by point that eggs had been unfairly condemned. The pressure worked. Within months, a second, noticeably softer edition quietly appeared, walking back some of its strongest language, linking fat to heart disease. 2 editions, 11 months apart, that alone tells you how unsettled this science really was. But contested or not, it was already moving. By 1980, this report became the foundation of the first official dietary guidelines for Americans, reissued by federal law every 5 years since, quietly shaping school lunches, food labels, and doctors' advice for 2 generations. Hers included, whether she ever read a page of it or not. A government built to fight hunger had just, almost by accident, become the architect of the modern American table. Years before anyone could prove it would make the country healthier, the committee believed it was handing Americans a clearer answer. What no one in that room predicted was what would happen once that answer left Washington and reached a supermarket shelf. Because the food industry was about to solve the government's new rule in a way nobody at that hearing had thought to ask about, and it would take less than 15 years to show up in almost every American kitchen. Fat became the enemy printed on every label in America. Food companies, chasing a new appetite for anything low-fat, found a simple trick: pull the fat out, pump in sugar to keep the taste, and the shelf life exactly the same. By 1992, one product turned this quietly into a phenomenon. Nabisco's SnackWell's fat-free Devil's Food cookies sold out completely within 3 months, with shoppers hoarding boxes and, according to later accounts, following delivery trucks just to get a fresh case. Picture a kitchen in 1993, not so different from the one this story started in. That same mother, 16 years older now, or a woman just like her, stands at the counter, a carton of milk beside her, her children in the next room. She picks up a box marked fat-free, without a second thought, because that was the only number anyone had ever taught her to watch. She isn't being careless. She thinks she's protecting them. Here is what the label didn't say. According to USDA dietary survey data, added sugar consumption rose sharply in those very years, from about 235 calories a day in the late 1970s to 318 calories a day by the mid-1990s. A 35% jump in almost exactly the years the low-fat aisle was expanding. The same year SnackWell's launched, the USDA unveiled the Food Pyramid, plastered across classrooms and cereal boxes, telling Americans to build meals around bread, cereal, rice, and pasta, and treat fat as something to use sparingly. A government chart and a supermarket cookie were, without ever meeting, telling the country exactly the same story. Even the American Heart Association joined in, launching its own Heart Check seal in 1995. Well-intentioned, screening for fat, cholesterol, and sodium, but silent on what had replaced the fat. Walk into an American kitchen today, and the same counter holds different objects. Where a carton of whole milk once sat, there's often a jug labeled reduced fat or skim. Where butter sat, a tub promising zero trans fat. That same mother's daughter, or someone very like her, stands at that counter now, reaching for a label the way her mother once did. The CDC's own data puts adult obesity at just over 40% today, up from that 13% baseline in 1977. Diabetes, once rare enough that a family had never known anyone with it, now touches more than 7% of American adults, and climbing. The same decades that saw fat disappear from labels saw sugar, refined starch, and total calories climb the fastest. That doesn't prove one caused the other. Researchers also point to portion sizes, activity, and the rise of ultra-processed food. But the timeline is hard to unsee. What is certain is this: the federal government answered a question in 1977 that no one in Washington had ever formally answered before. An entire food industry quietly rebuilt itself around whatever that answer happened to be, and the shelf in your own kitchen still carries the fingerprints of that decision. You've probably picked up a low-fat, reduced, or zero label this month without thinking twice. That instinct, trusting a single number on a box, is the same instinct that Mother trusted completely in 1977 and again in 1993. It wasn't naive then, it just wasn't the whole story. So what really changed at that dinner table in 1977? Not America's health, not right away. What changed was the relationship between government science, the food industry, and every American family's plate. A committee built to end hunger wrote rules for abundance on evidence that wasn't finished yet, and an industry moved faster than the science ever could. That pattern never really stopped. SnackWell's itself didn't survive, discontinued for good in 2022. But the shelf it once ruled never emptied out. Dozens of newer products still chase the same reduced and zero labels a generation once trusted without question. Picture that table one last time. The mother who said it in 1977 is likely a grandmother now. If she sat down at it today, the food wouldn't surprise her. The labels would. Reduced compared to what? Replaced with what? Questions her generation never got to ask in time. Questions still sitting on your own kitchen shelf. That's exactly what Health Evolution TV is here for. The quiet stories behind the things we take for granted.